They grew up in empty houses. They learned to fend for themselves before anyone taught them how. And somehow, in a world obsessed with boomers and millennials, an entire generation slipped through the cracks. Generation X, the forgotten ones. The ones who built their own quiet resilience while nobody was watching. And if you have ever felt like an outsider looking in, like someone who sees too much and says too little, then this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Because what shaped Gen X was not noise. It was silence. It was coming home to an empty kitchen and learning that self-reliance was not a choice. It was survival. And that survival shaped a psychology unlike anything that came before or after. Let us go back. Picture a house in the late 1970s. The television is on, playing whatever happens to be broadcasting, because there is no streaming, no pausing, no choosing. A child sits alone at the kitchen table, doing homework or pretending to, waiting for a parent who will not arrive until after dark. This was not neglect. This was just the way things were. Both parents working, divorce rates climbing, the economy demanding more and more from every household. And in that vacuum, something crystallized inside these children, something that would define them for the rest of their lives. They learned that nobody was coming to save them. They learned that if something needed to get done, they would have to figure it out themselves. And this was not a bitter lesson. It was a quiet one. It settled into their bones like cold water, like something they would carry forever without ever needing to name it. This is where the latchkey kid was born, a term that sounds almost quaint now, almost harmless. But it describes something profound. Children raising themselves in the gaps between adult attention. Children becoming self-sufficient not because they were precocious, but because they had no other option. They came home to houses where the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. They made their own snacks. They did their own laundry. They learned to occupy themselves for hours without adult supervision or intervention. And what does that do to a mind? What does it mean to grow up in a world where you are always just slightly on your own? It creates observers. It creates people who watch before they act, who listen before they speak, who learned early that the world does not owe you an explanation. Gen X did not grow up expecting fanfare. They grew up expecting to figure things out quietly and move on. This is why so many of them carry a certain stillness, a certain depth. They are not disengaged. They are simply processing everything from a step back. They developed what psychologists might call high-trait introspection, the ability to sit with their own thoughts, to analyze their own feelings, to question their own assumptions without external validation. Consider what that kind of childhood does to the developing brain. When you spend hours alone, you learn to be comfortable with yourself. You develop an internal dialogue. You build a relationship with your own mind that many people never form. Gen X children did not have smartphones to distract them from their thoughts. They did not have endless entertainment options. They had themselves, their imaginations, and the silence of empty houses. They read books because books were there. They invented games because no one else was around to play with. They stared out windows and let their minds wander to places no adult supervised. And in that freedom, in that unsupervised wandering, something important took root. They learned to think for themselves, not because anyone taught them to, but because there was no one else to think for them. This created adults who do not need external stimulation to feel alive. Adults who can sit in silence without reaching for a distraction. Adults who understand that boredom is not an emergency, that being alone is not the same as being lonely, that the mind left to its own devices can discover remarkable things. And here is where it gets interesting, because this introspection did not make them passive. It made them skeptical, deeply, quietly skeptical. Think about what they witnessed. Watergate, the energy crisis, the disillusionment of the Vietnam era spilling into their childhood memories. They watched the Challenger explosion on live television in their classrooms. They saw the Berlin Wall fall. They witnessed the AIDS crisis decimate communities while government officials looked the other way. They watched institutions fail in real time. They watched adults lie and get caught lying. They watched the American dream flicker like a faulty light bulb. And they took notes. This is why Gen X never fully trusted authority. Not in the rebellious, loud way that previous generations did. Not with protests and megaphones. Their distrust was quieter. It was a raised eyebrow, a refusal to be impressed, a tendency to ask uncomfortable questions that nobody else wanted to ask. When someone in power made a promise, Gen X waited to see if they would actually deliver. They had learned too many times that words without action were worthless. This skepticism was not cynicism. There is an important difference. Cynics believe that nothing good is possible. Skeptics simply require evidence before they believe. Gen X wanted to trust. They wanted to believe in institutions and leaders and the promises made by people in positions of power. But they had been burned too many times. They had watched too many scandals unfold. They had seen too many adults fail to live up to their own stated values. They became the generation that could smell insincerity from a mile away. They developed a radar for phoniness that still operates to this day. When someone tries too hard, when something seems too polished, when a message feels rehearsed, Gen X notices. They have always noticed. It is why they gravitate toward authenticity like it is oxygen. Because in a childhood filled with empty promises and absent parents, genuine connection became the rarest currency. Think about the cultural touchstones of their youth. The music that spoke to them was not polished pop anthems. It was grunge, punk, alternative rock, music that valued raw emotion over perfect production, music that admitted to feeling lost and confused and uncertain. Gen X connected with artists who seemed real, who seemed like they were struggling with the same questions. They distrusted anything that felt manufactured or focus grouped or designed by committee. And this brings us to something rarely discussed. The way Gen X approaches meaning. While other generations might chase success or status or likes on a screen, Gen X tends to dive for pearls. They are not interested in surface-level achievements. They want to understand why something matters. They want to find the hidden treasure beneath the obvious answer. They learned early that the things worth having are usually buried, usually overlooked, usually ignored by people in too much of a hurry to notice. This diving for pearls manifests in how they approach relationships, careers, creative work, everything. A Gen Xer might stay in a job that pays less because the work feels meaningful. They might choose friends based on depth of connection rather than social utility. They might pursue hobbies that nobody else understands simply because those hobbies satisfy something deep within their soul. This is why so many Gen Xers end up in creative fields, in counseling, in teaching, in any profession that rewards depth over speed. They have a tolerance for ambiguity that comes from growing up in a world that never bothered to explain itself. They are comfortable sitting with questions that have no easy answers, because that has always been their reality. They do not need everything wrapped up neatly. They do not need guarantees. But let us not romanticize this too much, because there is a shadow side to all this introspection, a cost that rarely gets acknowledged. Growing up self-reliant also means growing up without a roadmap for asking for help. Gen X learned to handle things alone, and that lesson does not disappear just because circumstances change. Many of them struggle to lean on others, even when they desperately need support. They carry burdens in silence, convinced that seeking help is somehow a failure of the self-sufficiency they worked so hard to build. This is the hidden weight they carry, the belief that needing someone else makes you weak. The difficulty in admitting vulnerability when your entire childhood taught you that vulnerability got you nowhere. When you learned at age 8 that crying did not bring your parents home any faster. When you discovered that complaining changed nothing. You internalize a dangerous message. You learn to stuff your feelings down. You learn to keep moving regardless of how you feel. And the world did not make this easier. Because while Gen X was busy building quiet competence, the spotlight moved elsewhere. The boomers dominated every conversation with their sheer numbers and their cultural weight. The millennials became a media obsession, analyzed and dissected in endless think pieces. And Gen X was left in the middle. Neither young enough to be interesting, nor old enough to be respected. The middle child of generations. Always overlooked, always underestimated. Consider what this feels like. You spend your entire childhood learning to be invisible, learning to take care of yourself, learning that nobody is paying attention. And then you become an adult, and the pattern repeats. Your generation is skipped over in every headline, every trend piece, every cultural analysis. It is as if the universe is confirming what you suspected all along. That you are meant to be overlooked, that your story is not worth telling. But here is what the world misses. Gen X is not invisible because they have nothing to offer. They are invisible because they do not demand attention. They do not need validation to know their own worth. And in a culture that rewards loudness, that rewards self-promotion, that rewards endless broadcasting of every thought and feeling, this kind of quiet confidence gets mistaken for absence. It is not absence. It is presence without performance. Gen X shows up. They do the work. They handle their responsibilities. They just do not feel the need to document every moment or announce every accomplishment. They carry a fundamental belief that work should speak for itself, that character is demonstrated through action rather than proclamation. In a world that has become a non-stop highlight reel, this approach makes them invisible. But invisible is not the same as absent. Now let us talk about the bridge, because Gen X occupies a unique position in human history. They are the last generation to remember a world before the internet. And they are the first generation to fully adapt to the digital age as adults. Think about what that means. They remember rotary phones and they use smartphones. They remember card catalogs and they navigate search engines. They remember a time when being unreachable was normal, when nobody expected an instant response, when boredom was something you simply lived with rather than scrolled away. They learned to type on electric typewriters and then taught themselves to code websites. They remember getting news from 3 television channels and now curate information from thousands of sources. They straddled 2 completely different worlds and found their footing in both. This gives them a perspective that younger generations cannot access and older generations often refuse to understand. They can translate between worlds. They understand why their parents struggle with technology. They understand why their children live through screens. And they carry the memory of what it felt like when neither of those things existed. They remember privacy as a default rather than something you had to fight for. They remember a time when your mistakes were not permanently searchable. when embarrassing moments faded into the past rather than living forever online. They remember what it felt like to truly disconnect, to be genuinely unreachable, to exist in moments without documentation. This memory gives them something valuable, a point of comparison, a benchmark for evaluating what has been gained and what has been lost. They can appreciate the miracles of modern technology while mourning the quiet that has disappeared. They can use the tools without being used by them. They have a relationship with technology that is practical rather than dependent. But this bridge comes with its own weight, because watching the world accelerate is disorienting. Gen X remembers when things moved slower, when attention spans lasted longer, when patience was a normal expectation. And now they watch a world that moves faster than it thinks, that reacts before it reflects, that values speed over depth. For a generation built on introspection, this can feel like drowning, like the world has forgotten how to be still, like the quiet spaces they need to function are disappearing, replaced by endless noise and constant stimulation. They watch younger people who have never known silence, who panic when left alone with their thoughts, who reach for their phones the moment boredom threatens, and they wonder what has been lost. And yet they adapt. They always adapt, because adaptation is what they learned in those empty houses, at those quiet kitchen tables, in all those hours spent figuring things out alone. Gen X does not resist change the way older generations sometimes do. They simply process it quietly, find their footing, and keep moving forward. Let us move forward in time, because the challenges facing Gen X today are different from the challenges of their childhood, but no less demanding. They have become what researchers call the sandwich generation, caught between aging parents who need care and growing children who need guidance, pulled in two directions at once, expected to be everything to everyone while their own needs disappear into the background. Consider the psychological toll of this position. You are watching your parents age, watching their independence fade, watching them become vulnerable in ways you never imagined. These are the people who were supposed to be strong. These are the people you once thought would live forever. And now you are scheduling their doctor appointments, managing their medications, having conversations about assisted living and end-of-life wishes. There is grief in this, a slow, quiet grief that does not announce itself. You are losing your parents incrementally, piece by piece, even while they are still alive. You are watching the people who raised you become people who need to be raised. And you are doing this while trying to maintain your own life, your own sanity, your own sense of who you are outside of your caretaking responsibilities. And simultaneously, you are trying to prepare your children for a world that looks nothing like the one you grew up in. A world that moves too fast, that offers too many choices, that provides too little stability. You are helping with college applications and explaining social media dangers and trying to instill values in an environment that seems designed to undermine everything you believe. You are parenting without a map because the territory keeps changing. Gen X handles this the way they handle everything, quietly, competently, without complaint. But the strain is real, the exhaustion is real, the sense of being stretched too thin, of giving more than you receive, of carrying responsibilities that never seem to lighten. Many of them wake up in the middle of the night with racing thoughts about everything that needs to be done. Many of them cannot remember the last time they prioritized their own well-being. And here is where the childhood lessons become both a blessing and a burden. That self-reliance, that ability to handle things alone, it helps them manage the chaos. But it also makes it harder to admit when they are struggling. It makes it harder to ask for the support they so freely give to others. This is the paradox of Gen X resilience. The very strength that carries them through hardship is also the wall that prevents them from receiving help. They built their own safety nets so well that they forgot how to fall into someone else's arms. They became so good at taking care of themselves that accepting care from others feels foreign and uncomfortable. But something is shifting, slowly, quietly, the way everything shifts for this generation. Gen X is beginning to recognize what they bring to the table, not because the world suddenly started paying attention, but because they are reaching an age where self-awareness deepens, where the patterns of a lifetime become visible in a way they were not before, where wisdom begins to crystallize from decades of quiet observation. They are realizing that their skepticism is valuable in a world drowning in misinformation, that their ability to sit with ambiguity is essential when easy answers are sold on every corner, that their tolerance for silence is a superpower in a culture addicted to noise. They are the generation that reads the fine print, that asks what is not being said, that remembers what life felt like before algorithms decided what you should think about, and in a world that increasingly feels shallow, their depth is not a liability. It is exactly what we need. Think about what they model for younger generations, not the constant performance of social media, not the desperate chase for external validation, but a quiet competence, a willingness to do the work without requiring an audience, an understanding that meaning is not something you broadcast. It is something you build slowly in the private spaces of your own life. Gen X shows us that it is possible to have a rich inner world without monetizing it, that you can be thoughtful without being performative. That depth does not require an audience. That patience is not weakness. That silence can be strength. And for older generations, Gen X offers something equally valuable. Proof that adaptation is possible, that you can hold on to the wisdom of the past while embracing the tools of the future, that being a bridge between worlds is not a weakness. It is a unique kind of strength. So where does this leave us? What do we make of a generation that grew up invisible and learned to thrive in the shadows? Perhaps we recognize that visibility was never the point, that the latchkey kids who raised themselves in empty houses did not need applause. They needed to survive. And they did more than survive. They developed a psychological architecture that the modern world desperately needs, but rarely acknowledges. They became the quiet observers, the ones who see what others miss. They became the skeptics who ask the questions nobody else wants to ask. They became the bridges who translate between worlds that have forgotten how to talk to each other. They became the steady hands in a culture that cannot stop shaking. And maybe, just maybe, it is time for the rest of us to stop overlooking them. Not because they need our attention, they have never needed that, but because we need what they carry. We need their depth in our shallow waters. We need their patience in our anxious rushing. We need their silence in our endless noise. We need their authenticity in our world of performance. Generation X did not disappear. They were here all along, watching from the margins, taking notes, keeping things together while nobody was looking. The forgotten generation, the invisible ones, the ones who learned to be their own anchor in a world that never stopped moving. And if you recognize yourself in any of this, if you have ever felt like the quiet one in a loud room, like the observer in a world of performers, like someone who sees too much and says too little, then maybe this was never about being forgotten at all. Maybe it was about being patient, about waiting for the world to catch up to a kind of wisdom it did not know it needed. The latchkey kids are grown now. Their houses are no longer empty, but the silence they learned to inhabit, the self-reliance they built from nothing but their own determination, the depth they developed in all those hours alone, that is exactly what lights the way forward. Not with fanfare, not with demands for attention, but with the quiet, steady presence they have always carried. The presence that says, I see you, I understand. I have been there too, and that perhaps is the most Gen X ending imaginable. No dramatic conclusion, no desperate plea for recognition, just the truth, stated simply, and a willingness to let it speak for itself. If this resonated with you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in these words, share your story in the comments below. Tell us what growing up Gen X meant for you, what you learned in the silence, what you carry with you still, because your story matters, even if the world forgot to tell you that. Thanks for being here. We will see you in the next one.